Raymond Dawson arrived at Molly's diner at precisely 9:15 a.m., just as he had every Sunday for the past 12 years. To most, he might have seemed like just another old man, frail, quiet, slow. But every line on his face, every measured step, every deliberate breath spoke of a history far deeper than his gentle manner revealed. Ray was 78, a retired Marine sergeant whose spine bore the permanent mark of a helicopter crash in the humid jungles of Vietnam. The doctors had said he'd never walk again, but Ray had never taken orders blindly, not even from fate. With quiet defiance, he had taught himself to stand, then to walk, and eventually, to carry his own tray every Sunday morning as a quiet ritual of discipline. He never let anyone do it for him, not because of pride, but because independence, to him, was sacred, an invisible medal earned and defended long after the uniform had been folded away. Each Sunday, Ray entered the diner with the slow, careful gait of a man who had learned to measure pain in units of purpose. The wooden cane he leaned on had been smoothed over the years by the calloused grip of his hands that once field-stripped rifles in the rain, now used to lift coffee and cut toast with the same methodical precision. He never rushed, never shuffled. Every motion was purposeful, rehearsed, dignified. Jenny, the hostess, always greeted him with a familiar nod. "Morning, Sergeant Dawson," she'd say, offering the warmth reserved for those who had been woven into the fabric of a place. She never asked for his order. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter. It hadn't changed in over a decade. And Ray never complained, never sent a plate back, never drew attention to himself. He asked for nothing except the simple dignity of doing things his own way. In a world that moved too fast, Ray moved like a man who had learned the cost of time. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was filled with the echoes of voices long gone, with memories of boot camp laughter and battlefield screams, of names etched on memorials that others walked past too quickly to read. To him, each step was a remembrance, each Sunday a ritual not of habit, but of survival. Ray didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened, because his words felt heavier, anchored by something unseen but deeply felt. He didn't wear his military pass like a badge. He carried it inside, in the way he held a door open without expecting thanks, or how he scanned a room instinctively, like the soldier in him never fully stood down. He wasn't just a regular at Molly's. He was part of its unspoken rhythm, its moral compass in human form. To the staff, he was both a quiet elder and an unsung sentinel, occupying the same booth by the window where sunlight poured in gently across his weathered features, warming the stiffness in his back that never truly faded. That booth wasn't just his seat, it was his watch post, his chapel, his final parade ground. And so, every Sunday, Raymond Dawson walked into that diner like he walked through life, not looking for sympathy, not hoping to be noticed, but simply proving to himself, and perhaps to the silent ghosts that walked with him, that he was still standing. It began as a whisper. Cruelty rarely shouts at first. From a corner booth where 4 men sat in identical fishing tournament shirts, the first words slid through the air like a thin blade. "If you can't carry your own tray, maybe stay home, Grandpa." They chuckled, the kind of laugh that doesn't seek joy but power. Ray Dawson didn't flinch. His hands were already occupied, one balancing his wooden cane against the counter, the other gripping a tray that trembled ever so slightly under the weight of his breakfast. He did not turn, did not react, did not let the comment land where it was meant to. He focused on his path ahead, the window booth, his quiet destination. Step by step, he moved across the bustling diner, a soldier pacing through invisible minefields. Each motion was careful, each breath controlled. But behind him, the laughter grew. The mockery wasn't just words, it was a performance, aimed to draw attention, to paint Ray as a character in someone else's joke. Another voice joined in, louder this time. "Bet he fakes the limp to get the veteran's discount." The sound pierced the ambient hum of the diner. For a moment, even the clatter of forks and the hiss of coffee machines seemed to hesitate. Marissa, the waitress, lingered near the kitchen door with a coffee pot in her hand, her eyes catching the scene but her feet rooted in hesitation. She'd served Ray for years, She knew his silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. But even armor wears thin when cracked by disrespect. Ray said nothing. His face remained an unreadable map of decades past. He reached his booth with slow determination, placing the tray down with the practiced steadiness of a man who had learned long ago to complete the mission despite the noise around him. But as he did, his fork slipped from the tray and clattered to the floor beside his seat. No one moved. Not the waiters. Not the customers who had heard the remarks and chosen their eggs over integrity. Ray paused. The simple task of retrieving the fork now loomed large. His back ached from the effort of standing. His knees screamed reminders of battles won and joints lost. Still, he reached for it, not to prove anything to the men laughing behind him, but because dignity, for him, was found in the doing. And then another voice, smug and sharp. "I'd help, but I don't do cosplay." Marines. This one hurt, not because of what it said, but because of how easily it was said. How casually the years of service, of sacrifice, could be dismissed with a punchline. Ray's expression didn't change, but his breath caught, just once, almost imperceptibly. The fork was still there on the floor. The laughter pressed on like a wind meant to knock him off balance. He began to lower himself, one hand braced against the table, the other reaching slowly for the fallen utensil. It was a quiet, excruciating motion, not because of pain, but because of what it represented. A man who had once carried wounded soldiers through enemy territory now forced to retrieve his own fork amid the scorn of a generation that never knew his battlefield. But he did it, because he always had. Marissa finally moved. She reached the table and picked up the fork before he could. She replaced it silently with a clean one, the look in her eyes apologizing for a world that sometimes forgot the meaning of the uniform Ray once wore. "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Dawson," she whispered, barely containing the tremor in her voice. Ray nodded once. "Not your fault, Marissa." He straightened his napkin with deliberate precision. Not to hide the tremor in his hands, but because order, discipline, was still his response to chaos. The corner booth went on laughing, though now with the edge of men unsure if they'd gone too far, or just far enough to entertain themselves. But they didn't know who they were mocking. They didn't know the years Ray had given to a country that now watched him shuffle through life like a shadow. They didn't know the names he remembered every time he passed the war memorial. They didn't know the ache in his bones that came not from age, but from a fall through enemy fire, or the night he lay awake in the jungle with the sound of mortars pounding like thunder in his ears. They didn't know, and worse, they didn't care. Ray didn't ask them to. He never did. But in that moment, surrounded by laughter that cut deeper than any shrapnel, he stood alone, not because he was weak, but because no one else had remembered how to stand with him. It happened without warning, quietly, like a change in weather you don't notice until you feel it in your bones. Ray was still sitting in his booth, his breakfast untouched, the eggs cooling beneath the weight of humiliation. The laughter from the corner table had dulled, but not disappeared. The men had moved on to mock someone on the TV now, their cruelty shifting targets with the ease of seasoned cowards. But the damage lingered in the air like smoke after gunfire, visible only to those who had breathed it before. Then the door opened, and in walked someone else. He wasn't young, but younger than Ray, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. His walk had a rhythm to it, not a strut, not a limp, just the confident balance of someone who'd learned to be aware of every step. He wore a plain green field jacket, unzipped, with faded patches on each shoulder. One of them, subtle and frayed, was a 101st Airborne insignia. The other bore a name, Castillo. He scanned the room with the instinctive glance of someone who'd once been trained to assess danger quickly. And when his eyes landed on Ray, still seated alone in that booth by the window, something in his posture shifted. Tension gathered, like muscle remembering pain. He walked toward Ray, without hesitation. Not fast, not slow, just direct. He didn't look at the men in the corner booth. "Not yet." "Sir?" His voice was low, respectful. His eyes locked on Ray's. "May I sit?" Ray looked up, a flicker of surprise in his gaze, but not suspicion. There was something familiar in the man, an unspoken language between soldiers. He nodded once. Castillo sat down across from him, resting his forearms on the table. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the untouched breakfast, then the slightly trembling hand Ray had tried to steady over the coffee mug. Finally, his eyes met Ray's again. "I saw what happened," he said, his tone even, controlled, but there was steel beneath it. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." Ray shook his head. "Nothing to be sorry for. You didn't cause it." "No," Castillo said. "But I know what it's like to carry silence. And I know what it costs." Something passed between them then, not just understanding, but recognition. Not of identity, but of experience. Different wars, maybe. Different hells. But the same ghosts. "I was in Mosul," Castillo continued, voice low enough that only Ray could hear. "Second deployment. 2006. I know what it's like to come back to a country that thanks you on paper and forgets you in person." Ray's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his plate. He didn't respond, but he didn't have to. The noise from the corner booth rose again. Another burst of laughter, hollow and forced. Castillo turned his head slightly, just enough to clock them in his peripheral vision. "I hate that laugh," he murmured. "Sounds like they've never had to be afraid of anything real in their lives." Ray looked out the window. "They don't know," he said quietly. "They've never had to." Castillo nodded. "That's not their fault. But the mockery? That is." For the first time, Ray's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, but in thought. As if something inside him stirred, not toward vengeance, but toward reclaiming something long dormant. Castillo's hand moved toward his inner jacket pocket. From it, he pulled a challenge coin, simple, weathered, marked with the insignia of a battalion long disbanded. He slid it across the table toward Ray. "I carry this," he said, "not for the wars we fought, but for the men we stood beside. When someone forgets who we are, I look at this. And I remember." Ray stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his own coat. He pulled out a different coin, worn smooth on the edges, the Marine Corps emblem faded but unbroken. He placed it next to Castillo's. Two histories, different metals, same weight. Castillo smiled softly. "Mind if I stay a while?" Ray's voice was steady. "Be my guest." For the rest of the meal, they spoke in fragments, memories wrapped in silence, moments wrapped in understanding. The laughter from the corner booth faded into irrelevance. At some point, one of the men looked over, puzzled by the presence of a stranger who had chosen to sit with the old man they had just mocked. But when his eyes met Castillo's, a gaze calm, unblinking, and unwavering, he looked away. The balance in the room had shifted. Not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through the quiet, immovable presence of solidarity. Ray didn't need someone to fight his battles. He'd done more than his share. But sometimes, even the strongest among us need to be reminded that we're not alone. And on that morning, amid coffee steam and cruelty, the presence of another soldier was enough to tilt the world back into something that resembled honor. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had weight, shape, and intention, like the heavy stillness just after a storm or the reverent hush of a battlefield long after the last shot has been fired. Ray and Castillo remained in the booth, their conversation having dissolved into a shared quiet that said more than words ever could. The half-eaten plates between them had grown cold, but neither man noticed. They sat in the kind of stillness that veterans often slip into when they've said what they need to say, and when what remains is something deeper than language. Outside the diner window, the morning light had shifted. It filtered in more softly now, brushing against Ray's shoulder and catching on the corner of the two challenge coins still resting on the table like small, silent monuments. Neither man had put his coin away. They simply stayed there, side by side, untouched and undisturbed. The men in the corner booth had gone quiet. Whether it was shame, discomfort, or the slow erosion of bravado, no one could say. They still sat there, occasionally mumbling to one another, but the sharp, mocking laughter was gone. What had replaced it wasn't remorse. Not yet, but a form of uncertainty. as if they weren't entirely sure what had shifted in the room, only that something had. And Ray noticed that. Not with satisfaction, not even with relief. Just awareness. He didn't need to see their regret. He didn't need an apology. What mattered more was the absence of cruelty. Sometimes, dignity isn't restored with loud words or acts of defiance. Sometimes, it returns with the quiet vanishing of scorn, the sudden vacancy of ridicule. That, too, is a kind of justice. He glanced at Castillo, who had leaned back slightly in the booth, his hands folded on the table. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between calm and alert, like a soldier who had learned how to rest with his back to the wall. There was no triumph in his face. Just presence. Just the choice to stay. Ray followed his gaze and found it fixed not on the men in the corner, but on the wall behind them, a faded collection of framed photos and memorabilia. One picture caught Ray's attention. A black and white image of a younger man in uniform, arms around two others, all three smiling like they hadn't yet understood what war would cost them. Ray's chest tightened. Not from grief, he had long since passed through that terrain, but from recognition. He'd stood in photos like that. He'd smiled with men he would never see again. And seeing it now, hanging slightly crooked on the diner wall, reminded him that even in a place where respect could be fleeting, memory still held its ground. Castillo spoke then softly. You ever think about how much we carry in silence? Ray didn't answer right away. He let the question linger. It wasn't rhetorical, it was honest. A question from one man to another, from one scar to another. Finally, he nodded. Every day, he said. Some days it's heavy. Some days it's just there. Castillo didn't nod. He didn't offer a platitude. He just looked down at the coins again. Still worth carrying, he murmured. Ray looked at him, his eyes sharper now, clearer. Only if someone else remembers it matters. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sound of cutlery and clinking glasses filled the background, the hum of a life that goes on regardless. But in that small booth by the window, two men sat in the kind of silence that isn't meant to be broken. Eventually, Castillo stood. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't have to. He slid his coin back into his jacket, gave Ray a nod, one soldier to another, and walked out into the sunlight. Ray sat there a while longer. He picked up his own coin, held it in his palm, felt its familiar edges. Then he, too, tucked it away. The silence lingered, but it no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like a space reclaimed, a truth remembered. And when Ray finally stood and left the diner, he didn't glance back at the corner table. He didn't need to. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Molly's diner began to shift in ways subtle, yet undeniable. The corner booth, once a stage for ridicule and whispered cruelty, grew quieter not because of fear or avoidance, but because something deeper was unfolding, a slow, tentative reckoning with the past, with respect, and with the invisible scars carried by a man who had quietly endured so much. The group of men who had jeered at Ray now found themselves cast in a different light, not by the loud judgments of others, but by their own reflection in the mirror of conscience. Their bravado, once a shield for insecurities and ignorance, had cracked under the steady gaze of Colonel Harrison's silent witness, the weight of history placed gently but firmly before them. It was as if the diner itself had become a crucible where youthful arrogance was melting into a cautious humility. One afternoon, as the sun slanted low through the diner's windows, the same men returned. Their fishing shirts felt less like armor and more like a reminder of their own youthful folly. They approached Ray's booth with hesitance, eyes lowered but determined. The leader, the one whose words had cut deepest, spoke first, his voice roughened by the unease of admitting fault. Sergeant Dawson, he began, we came back to apologize properly. What we did was unforgivable. Ray studied them for a long moment. The weight of years was etched into every line on his face, pain, endurance, and an unfathomable reserve of patience. He wasn't quick to forgive, nor was he bitter. His nod was quiet, measured, not a surrender, but an acknowledgement that the door had been nudged open. "You already apologized," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying the gravitas of someone who understood the complexity of grace. "Not properly," the man insisted, voice barely above a whisper. "My father served in Desert Storm. He'd be ashamed of what I did." That admission hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge spanning the gulf of misunderstanding and disrespect. Ray's eyes softened slightly, and then he said something that surprised everyone within earshot. "Next time, sit with me before you laugh behind me. You might learn something worth knowing." There was no grand absolution in those words, no sweeping forgiveness. Instead, it was an invitation, an opening for connection where there had been division. The kind of openness that only those who have carried wounds, visible or not, can offer. It was an offer to see beyond the surface, to recognize shared humanity in a world too quick to judge. The men stood a little straighter, their posture humbled but honest. The change wasn't immediate or complete, but it was real, a subtle turning of the tide within hearts hardened by ignorance and softened by truth. In that moment, the diner wasn't just a place to eat. It became a space where respect was reclaimed and humility took root. Ray settled back into his booth, the morning sun now casting a warm glow that seemed to wrap around him like a quiet benediction. Across the room, Colonel Harrison sat quietly, his presence steady and reassuring, a reminder that honor isn't always shouted. Sometimes it's shown in the simple, unspoken acts of standing beside those who deserve it most. And as the diner's chatter resumed, softer and more thoughtful now, Ray understood that the real battle wasn't just fought in distant jungles or foreign lands. It was here, in the hearts and minds of everyday people, in the slow, patient work of earning and giving respect where it is long overdue. The weeks that followed were marked by a quiet transformation, one that unfolded not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible ways that people began to connect, fractured pieces slowly mending under the steady weight of shared experience and newfound understanding. Ray, the man who had borne the brunt of mockery and indifference, became more than just a fixture at Molly's diner. He became a living testament to resilience, humility, and the enduring power of dignity. The men who had once jeered at him now approached with cautious respect, their earlier bravado replaced by something softer, an honest desire to learn and to make amends. Their apologies, tentative and unpolished, carried the raw weight of remorse, but Ray met them with a quiet patience forged through decades of hardship. He did not offer easy forgiveness, but neither did he close the door on the possibility of reconciliation. Instead, he extended an invitation, not just to sit beside him physically, but to sit with him in a deeper sense, to listen, to understand, and to share in the complexities of a life shaped by sacrifice and survival. This slow process of rapprochement revealed the profound lesson that true respect cannot be demanded or bought. It must be earned and given freely, often through the most difficult of conversations and the humblest of actions. Ray's own story, once a quiet undercurrent beneath the surface of everyday life, became a catalyst for change. It reminded those around him that courage takes many forms, not just the bravery shown on distant battlefields, but the resilience to face each day with quiet strength, the grace to endure without bitterness, and the courage to confront ignorance with dignity. Colonel Harrison's presence, steady and unyielding, underscored this message. His silent support had spoken volumes, but it was the ongoing connection between the two men that truly embodied the unspoken bond of brotherhood. Together, they demonstrated that honor transcends rank and age, bridging generations with a shared commitment to stand for what is right, even when words fail. At Molly's diner, the booth that had been the site of ridicule was transformed into a symbol of respect and remembrance, marked by a polished plaque bearing Ray's name, a quiet yet powerful acknowledgement of the sacrifices made and the battles fought long before the morning coffee was poured. This act, simple but profound, rippled through the community, inviting others to reflect on their own attitudes and the ways in which they honor those who have served. The story of Ray Dawson and the Marine Colonel became more than just a moment in a small-town diner. It became a living lesson in empathy, resilience, and the enduring strength of human connection. It taught that sometimes, Healing begins not with loud proclamations, but with a willingness to stand silently beside another, to listen without judgment, and to extend a hand when it is needed most. In the end, the greatest victory was not in silence or in confrontation, but in the gentle, persistent work of building bridges. One respectful conversation, one shared meal, and one quiet act of kindness at a time. It was a reminder that beneath every scar lies a story worth hearing, and within every heart, the capacity to change. In the quiet aftermath of confrontation and tentative reconciliation, the most profound action was not found in loud declarations or visible victories, but in the power of silence, a silence heavy with meaning, charged with unspoken truths, and resonant with the weight of shared understanding. It was in this stillness that real change took root, demonstrating how sometimes the absence of words can speak more powerfully than any speech ever could. Ray's silence was not one of submission or defeat. Rather, it was a deliberate, steadfast refusal to be defined by the cruelty he endured, an act of resistance woven with dignity and strength. This silence created a space where others could confront their own prejudices and insecurities, where the uncomfortable truth about respect and humanity could settle into the hearts of those who had once chosen ignorance. It was a silence that demanded reflection, inviting each observer to peer inward and reckon with the dissonance between their actions and their values. In that quiet, the harsh echoes of bullying were replaced by a contemplative calm, an internal dialogue sparked by the presence of a man who refused to break, who held his ground not with aggression, but with unwavering resolve. The impact rippled far beyond the walls of Molly's diner, touching the community's collective conscience. It reminded them that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the spaces between words. Ray's silent dignity challenged the loudness of mockery, shifting the balance from chaos to compassion, from division to understanding. In that space, people began to see him not as a target, but as a person whose scars told a story of bravery, pain, and endurance. It became clear that silence, in this context, was not emptiness but fullness, a fullness that carried the weight of lived experience and the promise of transformation. It was a profound statement that courage does not always require confrontation, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in standing still, allowing others to come to their own realizations without force or coercion. This deep, psychological drama unfolded quietly, its lessons penetrating through layers of pride and fear to reveal the essential truth that respect is earned through empathy, humility, and the simple act of witnessing another's pain without judgment. Ray's silence became a mirror, reflecting back to those who watched their own humanity, urging them toward a path of kindness and understanding. In the end, the strongest action was no action at all, an intentional stillness that spoke volumes, forever altering the dynamics of a small town, a diner, and the hearts within it. It was a testament to the power of quiet resilience, the weight of unspoken grace, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the loudest statement is made in complete silence.